In 1892, in a small town in Rhode Island, a man named George Brown stood at his daughter's grave in frozen January ground. She'd been dead 2 months. When they opened the coffin, what they found inside made grown men step back. Her body appeared fresh. Blood stained the corners of her mouth. Her heart, when they cut it from her chest, held what witnesses swore was liquid blood. The town believed Mercy Brown had become a vampire, rising from her grave to drain the life from her brother Edwin, who lay dying of the same wasting disease. They burned her heart and liver to ash, mixed it with water, and made her brother drink it. This happened in modern America, barely more than a century ago. Tonight, we'll be exploring the real mythology behind vampires, the beliefs that terrified entire communities, and how ancient cultures actually tried to protect themselves from the undead. Before we start, if you like these folklore videos, I'd love if you'd like the video and subscribe. Now, take a deep breath and settle in. Let's begin. In 1645, a Greek scholar named Leo Elatios, working as a librarian at the Vatican, published what may be the first methodological description of vampire beliefs. Writing in Latin, he documented what his fellow Greeks believed about the Vrykolakas, the undead creatures that haunted villages throughout the Greek islands and mainland. His account reveals a creature quite different from the aristocratic vampire of later fiction, rooted instead in the specific anxieties of Greek Orthodox Christianity. The Vrykolakas didn't drink blood, at least in most traditional accounts. Instead, it crushed people. It sat on sleeping victims, suffocating them with its weight, draining their life force through proximity rather than through any visible wound. Some versions describe it consuming flesh, particularly favoring the liver. But the core behavior involved a kind of spiritual oppression, a smothering presence that left victims exhausted, weakened, eventually dead. What created a Vrykolakas mattered enormously in Greek belief. The primary cause was excommunication from the Orthodox Church. When a priest pronounced anathema, cutting someone off from the sacraments and the community of believers, that person's body became vulnerable to demonic possession after death. The excommunicated soul couldn't rest properly. Instead, an evil spirit would enter the corpse, animating it, using it as a vessel for tormenting the living. This belief gave the church tremendous power over communities. Excommunication wasn't just a spiritual penalty. It was a sentence to undeath. Other paths to becoming a Vrykolakas involved violations of sacred order. Someone who died without receiving last rites, who committed suicide, who lived a particularly wicked life, who was cursed by their parents, these people risked transformation. Eating meat from a sheep that had been wounded by a wolf or werewolf could doom you. So could dying far from home without proper burial in consecrated ground. The rules created a comprehensive system of religious and social control, linking correct behavior in life to peaceful rest in death. The appearance of a Vrykolakas reflected its unnatural state. The body didn't decay properly. Instead, it swelled, becoming bloated and drum-like. When struck, it made a hollow sound, like beating on a stretched hide. The skin took on a ruddy, flushed color, as if the creature had been feeding well. This robust appearance, so different from the expected decomposition, convinced people that something was actively maintaining the corpse, keeping it vital and dangerous. The Vrykolakas had specific behaviors that villagers came to recognize. It would wander at night, approaching houses and knocking on doors. Crucially, it would knock only once and call out the name of someone inside. If that person answered immediately, they would die within days, and potentially become a Vrykolakas themselves. This belief created a social rule that persisted in some Greek villages into the 20th century. Never answer a knock on the door until the second knock. Wait. Make sure whoever is calling will knock twice. The first knock might be a test, might be death checking to see if you're foolish enough to respond. Beyond the door knocking, the Vrykolakas engaged in poltergeist activity. It would throw objects, create loud disturbances, destroy property. It brought disease to villages, spreading illness through its mere presence. Often, it would target its own family first, visiting former loved ones before moving on to torment the broader community. The creature represented a complete inversion of proper kinship relations. Instead of ancestors who blessed and protected their descendants, the Vrykolakas returned to destroy them. Dealing with the Vrykolakas required both religious and physical interventions. The body had to be exhumed, which could only safely be done on Saturday, the one day when the creature rested in its grave. A priest would perform exorcisms, sprinkling holy water, reading prayers meant to drive out the possessing demon. If spiritual methods failed, physical destruction became necessary. The body might be decapitated, with the head buried separately from the torso. It might be burned entirely to ash. Stakes through the heart worked, as did weighing the corpse down with heavy stones. During the Great Famine of 1941 and 42, when 300,000 Greeks starved to death and graveyards overflowed, families faced a terrible dilemma. They had to bury their loved ones in unconsecrated ground outside official cemeteries. This meant the dead might become Vrykolakas. Some families, desperate to prevent this fate, chose to decapitate their relatives before burial. Better to ensure the body couldn't rise than to risk it returning as a monster. The Vrykolakas tradition influenced vampire lore throughout Europe. Greek accounts reached Western audiences earlier than Slavic ones, shaping how educated Europeans understood the undead. The emphasis on excommunication and improper burial, the connection to Orthodox Christianity, the specific methods of creation and destruction, all of these elements fed into the broader European vampire tradition. When Slavic vampire panics reached Western attention in the 18th century, Western writers already had Greek Vrykolakas accounts as a reference point, a framework for understanding what seemed like Eastern European superstition. The Greek Vrykolakas tradition set a foundation, but the vampire belief truly flourished in Slavic lands. Here, the creature took on characteristics that would eventually define our modern understanding. The Slavic vampire emerged from a world view where the boundary between living and dead remained permeable, where the recently deceased could return for reasons both malicious and mundane. The strigoi of Romanian folklore represented one of the most developed Slavic vampire traditions. These beings could exist as living witches or as the undead, and the distinction mattered. A living strigoi had a soul that left the body at night to feed on others. A dead strigoi was a corpse reanimated by an evil spirit or by its own restless soul. Both types drank blood, but the dead version posed the greater threat because it had already crossed the boundary that living people feared most. What made someone become a strigoi after death? The reasons varied but followed patterns. A child born with a caul, that thin membrane sometimes covering an infant's head at birth, carried the mark. So did someone born with a tail or extra nipples, physical abnormalities that suggested something fundamentally wrong with the person's nature. The seventh son of a seventh son bore the curse. Someone who died violently, who committed suicide, who died unbaptized, who broke sacred oaths, these people couldn't rest properly. Their souls remained bound to earth, trapped in bodies that should have been free of them. The Polish traditions around Upia, their term for vampire, emphasize the creature's voracious appetite. These beings didn't just feed on blood, they consumed everything they could, gorging themselves with a hunger that could never be satisfied. Accounts describe Upia with bloated bodies, swollen tongues, faces flushed dark red with the blood they'd consumed. They would return night after night to the same victims, draining them slowly over time, rather than killing them outright. Serbian vampire traditions contributed the idea of epidemics caused by the undead. When plague or disease swept through a village, people often blamed the first person who had died from the illness. That initial victim had become a vampire, spreading the sickness from beyond the grave. This belief led to exhumations during disease outbreaks, desperate attempts to find and destroy the corpse that was supposedly causing the epidemic. Sometimes entire cemeteries would be dug up, bodies examined, suspect corpses staked or burned. The methods of becoming a vampire in Slavic tradition went beyond moral failures or physical marks. A cat jumping over a corpse before burial could transform it. So could a dog or any animal passing over the body. Birds flying over a grave carried the same risk. These beliefs made the period between death and burial intensely dangerous. Bodies had to be watched constantly, protected from any animal that might contaminate them with the potential for undeath. Being buried improperly almost guaranteed transformation. This didn't just mean unconsecrated ground, though that certainly qualified. It meant any deviation from correct ritual practice. If the body wasn't positioned properly, if the grave faced the wrong direction, if the burial happened at the wrong time of day, if proper prayers weren't said, if the deceased wasn't given coins for passage to the afterlife, any of these violations could trap the soul and create a vampire. The relationship between vampires and their victims in Slavic folklore often remained intimate. The undead would target their own families first, returning to the homes they'd known in life. They would call to their spouses, their children, using familiar voices to lure loved ones into opening doors or windows. Sometimes they would even maintain their household routines, appearing at dinner time, expecting their old places at the table. The horror came from recognizing the person you'd loved in the monster trying to destroy you. Slavic vampire tradition also introduced the idea of the vampire creating more of its kind through attack. Someone drained by a vampire would sicken, waste away, and eventually die. After death, they too would rise as undead, continuing the cycle. This made vampire outbreaks similar to disease epidemics in the popular imagination. One vampire could spawn many, and those many could spawn more, until entire villages fell to the plague of undeath. The physical appearance of Slavic vampires differed from later literary interpretations. These weren't pale, elegant aristocrats. They looked ruddy, healthy, well-fed. Their bodies showed no signs of decay. Hair grew long and wild. Fingernails extended to claws. They smelled of the grave, of rot despite their preserved appearance. Blood stained their faces and hands. They represented corruption hiding beneath a veneer of vitality. Slavic traditions emphasized that vampires grew more powerful over time if left undestroyed. A newly risen vampire might be clumsy, limited to its grave at night, easily deterred. But an older vampire, one that had been feeding for months or years, could range far from its burial place. It could move during the day. It could command animals, especially wolves and bats. It gained intelligence, cunning, the ability to plan and strategize rather than simply hunting on instinct. This progression created urgency around vampire suspicions. If you thought someone had become a vampire, you had to act quickly before it grew too powerful to stop. The window for effective intervention was narrow. Wait too long, and the creature would become nearly invincible, a blight on the land that could only be stopped by the most extreme measures. Far from Eastern Europe, Chinese folklore developed its own tradition of the undead. The Jiangshi, whose name translates roughly to stiff corpse, emerged from a completely different cultural context, but arrived at surprisingly similar fears about the dead refusing to stay dead. The Jiangshi moved by hopping, arms outstretched, legs held together by rigor mortis. This distinctive mode of travel came from real practices around transporting corpses. In Qing Dynasty China, when people died far from their ancestral homes, their bodies needed to be returned for proper burial. Professional corpse handlers would bind bodies to bamboo poles and carry them through the night, traveling when roads were empty and when decay would progress more slowly in cooler air. The flexing of the bamboo poles as the carriers walked created an illusion of the corpses bouncing along, hopping down mountain paths in the darkness. These corpse processions inspired stories. Travelers who glimpsed them from a distance, seeing what looked like bodies moving on their own through the night, brought tales back to their villages. The accounts grew in the telling. The corpses weren't being carried. They were hopping by themselves, animated by forces no one fully understood. A practice born of practical necessity, transformed into folklore about the undead. Traditional Chinese philosophy explained the Jiangshi through the concept of hun and po, the two types of soul that inhabit a living body. The hun represents the higher soul, associated with thought, memory, personality. The po represents the lower soul, tied to the body, more primitive and aggressive. When someone died properly, both souls separated from the body and departed. But if something went wrong, if the hun left while the po remained trapped in the corpse, that lingering po could reanimate the body, creating a Jiangshi. What caused this incomplete separation of souls? Death far from home ranked high among the causes. So did dying violently or suddenly, giving the souls no time to prepare for departure. Improper burial rituals could trap the PO. Being struck by lightning-animated corpses, a pregnant cat jumping over a body could create a Jiangshi, as could failure to follow correct funeral procedures. The reasons paralleled European vampire traditions while emerging from distinctly Chinese philosophical frameworks. The Jiangshi didn't feed on blood in traditional accounts. Instead, it absorbed qi, the life force that flows through all living things. It would seek out living people and draw their qi into itself, leaving victims weakened, aged, drained of vitality. Some versions describe the Jiangshi literally breathing in a person's breath, inhaling their life essence. This feeding method tied to Chinese medical understanding of how life force moved through the body. The appearance of a Jiangshi reflected its state of death and preservation. The body looked rigid, locked in rigor mortis. Skin took on a greenish or greyish pallor. Hair grew long and wild. Fingernails extended into claws. Some accounts describe a phosphorescent glow surrounding the creature, a cold light emanating from the corpse as it hopped through darkness. The more decayed the body, the more dangerous the Jiangshi, as advanced decomposition suggested. It had been feeding successfully for a long time. Jiangshi possessed specific supernatural abilities beyond their life-draining power. They could sense living people by detecting breath, which is why holding your breath could make you invisible to them. They feared their own reflections, which could be used to repel them. Sunlight weakened or destroyed them, forcing them to seek shelter before dawn. They were drawn to count small objects, a compulsion that could distract them. if you scattered rice or seeds in their path. Protection against Jiangshi relied heavily on Taoist practices. Yellow paper talismans covered with red ink spells could trap or repel the creatures. A talisman attached to the Jiangshi's forehead would freeze it in place, rendering it immobile. Mirrors placed there strategically would terrify the creature with its own image. Items made from peach wood, considered sacred in Taoist tradition, could harm or repel Jiangshi. The blood of a black dog served as a powerful weapon. So did a rooster's crow, which could send the creature fleeing. Taoist priests specialized in handling Jiangshi, using a combination of ritual knowledge and practical techniques. They could command the creatures to hop in formation, leading them back to proper burial sites. They performed exorcisms to drive out the trapped Po and free the body. They created protective barriers around villages, using talismans and ritual objects to keep Jiangshi at bay. This professional class of vampire handlers emerged because the Jiangshi threat was taken seriously enough to require specialized expertise. The Jiangshi tradition influenced vampire beliefs throughout East Asia. Similar creatures appear in Korean, Japanese, and Vietnamese folklore, each culture adapting the basic concept to fit local beliefs. The hopping corpse became a recognizable figure across the region, appearing in folk tales, warning stories, and eventually in popular entertainment. The Hong Kong Jiangshi films of the 1980s brought the creature to global awareness, though these cinematic versions often played the horror for comedy. What makes the Jiangshi fascinating in the context of vampire folklore is how it emerged independently from European traditions, while addressing similar anxieties. Different cultures, separated by thousands of miles and distinct philosophical frameworks, all developed explanations for bodies that wouldn't stay in the ground. The specifics differed, but the underlying fear remained constant. Death might not be final, and the dead might return to prey upon the living. The folklore of Southeast Asia developed some of the most distinctive vampire traditions, creatures that diverged dramatically from European models, while revealing the same core anxieties about death, disease, and the vulnerability of women and children. The Penanggalan of Malaysian and Indonesian folklore presents one of the most striking vampire variants. During the day, the Penanggalan appears as a normal woman, living among the community, perhaps working as a midwife. At night, her head detaches from her body, trailing her organs and entrails behind it as it flies through darkness searching for prey. The stomach, liver, intestines, all dangle from the severed neck as the disembodied head soars through the night air, hunting. How someone becomes a Penanggalan varies by region. The most common account involves a woman practicing black magic to achieve eternal beauty. The ritual requires meditating while sitting in a large vat of vinegar submerged up to the neck. If the ritual works, she gains the ability to detach her head at will. If interrupted during the meditation, the violent disruption causes an involuntary and irreversible transformation. Other versions describe curses, demonic pacts that grant power at the cost of becoming something monstrous. The Penanggalan specifically targets pregnant women and newborns. It will hover on rooftops of houses where women are in labor, waiting for the moment of birth. Then it descends, using an elongated tongue to drink blood, particularly the blood of childbirth. Contact with the trailing organs causes severe, painful sores that resist healing without intervention from a traditional healer. The creature represents terror directed at the most vulnerable moments of life, when mothers and infants face the greatest danger, even without supernatural threats. Protecting against the Penanggalan requires understanding its physical limitations. The exposed organs can be injured by sharp objects, so people would scatter thorny leaves around houses where women had recently given birth. The Menquang plant, with its particularly sharp thorns, was considered most effective. Windows would be festooned with thorny vines. The goal was to catch or damage the trailing entrails as the creature tried to enter, causing enough pain to drive it away. When the Penanggalan returns from its hunting, it must reunite with its body before dawn. It locates its discarded lower half and lowers the head and organs back into place. But the organs, swollen from feeding, often don't fit easily. The creature keeps a barrel of vinegar nearby specifically to shrink the organs, soaking them until they compress enough to slip back into the body cavity. If someone finds the body during the night and fills it with broken glass or thorns, the Penanggalan cannot rejoin, and it will die when sunlight comes. The Philippines has the Manananggal, similar in some ways to the Penanggalan, but with crucial differences. The Manananggal severs at the waist rather than the neck. The upper torso, complete with head and arms, grows bat-like wings and flies off into the night, leaving the legs and lower body behind. It makes a distinctive ticking sound as it flies, tick tick tick, which gives the creature one of its alternative names. Folklore states that the fainter the sound, the closer the creature actually is, a reversal meant to confuse and disorient potential victims. Like the Penanggalan, the Manananggal primarily hunts pregnant women. It uses a long proboscis-like tongue to extract fetuses from sleeping mothers, or to drain blood from victims without waking them. The creature particularly favors the blood and organs of the unborn, making it a figure of terror in communities where maternal and infant mortality already ran terrifyingly high. The transformation into a Manananggal comes through various means. Some women are born with the ability and must decide whether to embrace or suppress it. Others acquire it through practicing forbidden magic or making deals with malevolent spirits. The creature's connection to witchcraft and female power reflects complex cultural attitudes toward women who operated outside traditional domestic roles. Destroying a Manananggal requires finding and desecrating its lower half while it's separated. Sprinkling salt, ash, or crushed garlic on the exposed wound prevents reunion. Without its legs, the creature cannot return to human form and will perish at dawn. Some traditions specify placing broken glass or sharp objects in the severed body, similar to Penanggalan defenses. The vulnerability of the separated body creates a clear weakness, a way for communities to fight back against the supernatural threat. Thailand has the krasu, similar to the Penanggalan in being a floating head with trailing entrails, but with its own specific characteristics and origin stories. Cambodia has the AHP. Laos has the kasu. Each represents local variations on the theme of the detached head or torso that hunts at night, drinks blood, threatens pregnant women and children. The consistency across the region suggests either cultural diffusion of the belief or independent development, driven by similar social and medical conditions. These Southeast Asian vampires share common features. They're exclusively female in traditional accounts. They target the most vulnerable populations. They're associated with midwifery and childbirth, suggesting anxiety around these dangerous medical events. They can appear normal during the day, hiding in plain sight. They have specific physical vulnerabilities that give communities methods to fight back. And they represent fears about women who possess power outside conventional social structures. The emphasis on organs, entrails, viscera sets these traditions apart from European vampires, where European vampires are often associated with seduction and the neck. Southeast Asian vampires are about raw physicality, exposed biology, the messy reality of bodies. These aren't elegant predators. They're grotesque manifestations of biological processes that cultures didn't fully understand. Embodiments of the dangers that lurked in the transition from pregnancy to birth to motherhood. Modern medicine offers explanations for vampire beliefs that our ancestors couldn't access. Several rare diseases produce symptoms that, to people without scientific understanding, might seem supernatural. Understanding these conditions reveals how easily mystery becomes myth when observation lacks explanation. Porphyria represents a group of rare inherited blood disorders that affect how the body produces heme, a crucial component of hemoglobin. When the process fails, substances called porphyrins build up in the body, creating a cascade of symptoms that, viewed through a medieval lens, could seem vampiric. The cutaneous forms of porphyria, particularly congenital erythropoietic porphyria, cause extreme sensitivity to sunlight. Exposure to sun creates painful blisters, burning, severe skin damage. Over time, repeated exposure causes facial disfigurement, scarring, tightening of the skin around the mouth. The gums recede, making teeth appear elongated, fang-like. Fingers can become twisted and claw-like. Hair may grow excessively on the face. The damage accumulates with each exposure, transforming appearance in ways that must have seemed horrifying to both sufferers and observers. People with severe photosensitivity would naturally avoid sunlight. They would emerge at night when the sun couldn't harm them. This nocturnal pattern matches vampire behavior in folklore. The connection seems almost too perfect to be coincidental, especially when you consider other symptoms. Some forms of porphyria cause urine to turn dark red or purple. To someone unfamiliar with the disease, this might look like blood in the urine. Combined with the general paleness that comes from avoiding sunlight, and from anemia, a symptom of some porphyria variants, this could create an impression of someone consuming blood. Historical medical treatments, before modern understanding of porphyria, sometimes involved recommendations to drink blood, though this was typically animal blood and wouldn't have actually helped. The practice might have reinforced beliefs about blood drinking. Garlic presents an interesting connection. Garlic contains compounds that can trigger or worsen porphyria symptoms in some people. Someone with porphyria might genuinely react badly to garlic, showing distress or discomfort when exposed to it. This could have contributed to folklore about garlic-repelling vampires, based on observed reactions from people with the condition. The prevalence of porphyria in certain noble families of Eastern Europe has been documented. The disease is genetic, inherited, and can be more common in populations where intermarriage within limited gene pools concentrates recessive traits. European nobility often married within relatively small circles to preserve bloodlines and consolidate power. This practice would increase the likelihood of genetic disorders appearing with unusual frequency. However, the specific form of porphyria that creates the most striking symptoms, congenital erythropoietic porphyria, is extraordinarily rare, affecting fewer than 1 in a million people. For this reason, many modern historians and medical researchers now view the porphyria vampire connection as an interesting medical coincidence rather than a true historical cause for the widespread folklore. Some researchers have suggested that the vampire myths might trace back to individual cases of porphyria that became legendary. A person with severe symptoms might have been remembered in local stories, their condition misunderstood, and attributed to supernatural causes. Over generations, the actual disease would be forgotten, leaving only the tales of someone who avoided sunlight, seemed to have fangs, reacted badly to garlic, and whose appearance changed in disturbing ways. However, the connection between porphyria and a vampire folklore has limitations and critics. The disease is extremely rare. Congenital erythropoietic porphyria, the type with the most dramatic symptoms, affects fewer than 1 in a million people. The rarity makes it unlikely to account for widespread vampire beliefs across multiple cultures. Vampire folklore predates documented cases of porphyria in the medical literature, though the disease itself obviously existed before doctors identified and named it. More importantly, the specific symptoms of porphyria don't align perfectly with traditional vampire folklore. Folkloric vampires weren't described as disfigured or claw-handed. They appeared healthy, robust, well-fed. The bloated, ruddy corpses found in exhumations bear no resemblance to the wasted appearance of severe porphyria sufferers. Vampires in traditional accounts didn't fear sunlight. That characteristic came later, in literary interpretations. The folkloric undead operated at night because that's when supernatural threats were believed to be most active, a pattern that applies to many creatures in folklore. The garlic connection also proves weaker under scrutiny. While garlic can trigger symptoms in some porphyria patients, the vampire-repelling properties of garlic in folklore relate to its broader use as a protective herb against all sorts of evil, not specifically vampires. Many cultures use garlic against various supernatural threats, suggesting the belief stems from garlic's strong smell and preservative properties rather than observed reactions from disease sufferers. Porphyria might explain individual cases that contributed to vampire legends, particularly in explaining why certain people were accused of vampirism while alive. Someone with photosensitivity, facial disfigurement, and unusual urine might well have been viewed with suspicion in a superstitious community, but the disease cannot account for the core of vampire folklore, the exhumation of corpses that showed signs of continued life, the spread of disease through families and villages, the belief that the dead could rise and attack the living. Those beliefs require different explanations. The appeal of the Porphyria connection lies in how it seems to solve the vampire mystery with a single medical explanation. Modern audiences like neat answers that tie up folklore with scientific fact, but the reality proves more complex. Vampire beliefs arose from multiple sources: misunderstood decomposition, epidemic disease, religious anxiety about proper burial and the state of the soul, cultural fears about death and contagion. Porphyria might have contributed in small ways, explaining individual cases, but it wasn't the origin of the vampire myth. Another disease offers a more compelling explanation for specific aspects of vampire behavior. Rabies, a viral infection transmitted through animal bites, produces symptoms that align disturbingly well with vampire characteristics described in folklore, particularly during the period when vampire panics were most intense. Rabies begins with flu-like symptoms: fever, weakness, headache. These progress to far more dramatic neurological effects. The virus travels through the nervous system to the brain, causing inflammation that leads to a constellation of behavioral changes. People infected with rabies become agitated, confused, sometimes violent. They may experience hallucinations. Sleep becomes difficult or impossible, leading to severe insomnia and nighttime restlessness. The infected person might wander at night, unable to rest, driven by the virus's effect on their brain. One of the most characteristic symptoms of rabies is hydrophobia, an intense fear of water. The virus causes painful spasms of the throat muscles when the infected person tries to swallow. Even seeing water can trigger these spasms. The person may foam at the mouth as saliva builds up that they cannot swallow. They avoid drinking avoid water entirely, react with visible distress to its presence. In folklore, vampires cannot cross running water, a belief that might trace to observing rabies sufferers recoiling from water sources. The aggression associated with rabies can manifest as biting. The virus is transmitted through saliva, and it appears to alter behavior in ways that promote transmission. Infected animals become unusually aggressive and bite more readily. Infected humans can show similar patterns. A Spanish physician named Juan Gómez Alonso published research in 1998 drawing specific connections between rabies symptoms and vampire folklore, noting how the disease could explain the spread of vampirism through biting. Rabies causes hypersensitivity to stimuli. Bright lights become painful. Loud sounds provoke distress. Even mirrors can trigger violent reactions, possibly explaining folklore about vampires lacking reflections or avoiding mirrors. The face of someone with rabies can contort in unusual ways due to muscle spasms. Their expression becomes distorted. The lips may draw back, exposing teeth in something like a snarl. Combined with the aggressive behavior and biting, this creates an image of a person transformed into something barely human. The disease affects sleep patterns dramatically. Insomnia drives people to wander at night. Altered circadian rhythms mean they might be most active during hours when healthy people sleep. To neighbors observing someone prowling restlessly through nighttime hours, displaying aggressive behavior, avoiding water, showing a disturbing facial expression, the person might well seem possessed or transformed into something predatory. Rabies also affected sexual behavior in some cases. The infection can cause priapism in men and increased arousal generally. Historical medical accounts describe rabies patients displaying inappropriate sexual aggression. Vampires in folklore often carried sexual overtones, seducing victims, inspiring desire alongside terror. The connection between sexual aggression and vampire mythology might trace partly to observations of rabies behavior. The timing strengthens the rabies hypothesis. In the early 18th century, Eastern Europe experienced significant rabies epidemics, particularly in Hungary and surrounding regions. This coincides almost exactly with the period historians call the Great Vampire Epidemic, from 1725 to 1755, when vampire reports peaked across the continent. As rabies spread through dog and wolf populations, human cases would have increased. Communities searching for explanations for bizarre, frightening behavior in their neighbors might have reached for supernatural interpretations. The transformation aspect of vampire folklore also fits rabies patterns. Someone bitten by a rabid animal would seem normal for weeks or even months during the incubation period. Then they would suddenly change, becoming aggressive, violent, different from who they were. The transformation seemed complete and irreversible, as if the person had become something else entirely. In folklore, this became the vampire's curse, the bitten victim transforming into a monster. Animals played a crucial role in both rabies and vampire traditions. Vampires were often associated with wolves, dogs, and bats, all rabies vectors. In some Eastern European folklore, vampires could transform into these animals. The connection makes sense if vampire beliefs grew partly from rabies observation. The disease came from animals, particularly wolves and dogs. Seeing the connection between animal bites and subsequent human behavior changes, people might well have imagined a supernatural link. A transformative curse passed through the bite. The progression toward death in rabies also parallels vampire attack descriptions. Victims waste away over the course of the illness. They stop eating and drinking because of throat spasms. They lose weight, become weak and pale. their condition deteriorates until death becomes inevitable. In folklore, vampire victims experience similar wasting, growing progressively weaker as the vampire drained their life force over multiple visits. Rabies explains the transmission pattern central to vampire beliefs. One vampire could create many through biting. Those victims would transform and bite others. The chain of transmission matched disease epidemics. In villages where rabies spread, you would see multiple people displaying similar symptoms, all connected through a chain of contact or proximity, exactly the pattern attributed to vampire outbreaks. Unlike Porphyria, rabies was neither rare nor limited to specific genetic lineages. It was epidemic, spreading through communities, affecting anyone bitten by infected animals. The prevalence makes it a more plausible contributor to widespread folklore than a genetic condition affecting tiny numbers of people. Rabies would have been a known threat, a disease people encountered with some regularity, unlike the extreme rarity of Porphyria. The Rabies Connection doesn't explain every aspect of vampire folklore. It doesn't account for the exhumation practices, the belief that corpses appeared preserved and bloated. Those elements came from misunderstanding decomposition. But for the behavioral characteristics of vampires, the aggression, the biting, the transformation, the nighttime activity, the aversion to water, rabies provides a remarkably complete explanation. The disease may well have shaped how people imagine vampires behaving, contributing specific details to the broader tradition. Once communities identified someone as a vampire or as likely to become one, they acted. The methods they used reveal both their terror and their determination to protect the living from the undead. Archaeological evidence shows these practices weren't just stories. People actually drove stakes through corpses, decapitated bodies, took extraordinary measures to ensure the dead stayed in the ground. Staking the corpse represented the most famous vampire killing method. The stake would be driven through the body, most often through the heart, but sometimes through other locations. Bulgarian burials show iron rods through the chest cavity, positioned to pierce vital organs. The stake served multiple purposes. It pinned the body physically to the earth, preventing it from rising. It destroyed the heart, the seat of life, and it demonstrated the community's resolve, the violence they were willing to inflict on what had been a neighbor, perhaps a family member. The material of the stake mattered in different traditions. Ash wood was preferred in some regions, hawthorn in others. Iron stakes appear in archaeological contexts, suggesting metal's perceived power against supernatural threats. The stake had to be driven through in a single blow in some traditions. If it took multiple strikes, the vampire might wake and escape. This added pressure to an already traumatic procedure, requiring strength and accuracy while dealing with what everyone believed was a dangerous supernatural entity. Decapitation offered a more permanent solution. If the body had no head, it couldn't rise, couldn't see, couldn't bite. Archaeological excavations across Europe have found numerous vampire burials where the skull was removed and placed between the legs, at the feet, or in the hands of the corpse. The positioning wasn't random. It created a puzzle for the vampire. Could it find its head? Could it reattach it? Even if it could rise, it would be hampered, confused, easier to avoid or destroy. Some burials go further, showing bodies buried face down. The logic held that if the vampire tried to dig its way out, it would dig in the wrong direction, deeper into the earth rather than toward the surface. The corpse might claw through dirt forever, moving away from the world of the living rather than toward it. This method required less violence to the body than staking or decapitation. making it perhaps easier for families to accept, but it demanded correct positioning at burial before suspicion set in. Stones and rock served multiple protective functions. Heavy stones placed on top of the corpse weighed it down, adding physical mass it would need to overcome to rise. Stones placed in the mouth prevented the corpse from chewing through its shroud, based on beliefs that such chewing was how vampires first began to feed. The practice of putting objects in corpses' mouths appears across many cultures and time periods, suggesting ancient roots for this particular protective measure. Sickles placed across the neck created a decapitation trap. If the corpse tried to rise, the sharp blade would sever the head. Polish burials show this practice clearly, with iron sickles positioned precisely across the throat of the deceased. The method allowed for a conditional response. If the person was innocent, stayed dead as they should, the sickle did nothing. But if they tried to rise, they would destroy themselves in the attempt. Certain substances were believed to repel or harm vampires. Garlic appears frequently in both folklore and practice. Cloves of garlic might be placed in the mouth, in the coffin, around the grave. The strong smell presumably offended or harmed the supernatural creature. Salt, with its preservative and purifying properties, served similar functions. Holy water, blessed by priests, could protect spaces or harm vampires when splashed on them. Religious items, crosses, icons, consecrated bread, all served as barriers against the undead. Some communities took preventive measures at the time of death, before burial. They might drive nails through the coffin lid into the corpse, pinning it in place. They might bind the body tightly with ropes or chains. In areas where vampire fears ran particularly high, bodies might be buried at crossroads, the intersection believed to confuse the undead about which direction to travel, or they might be buried with their feet toward the west, rather than the traditional east, disrupting the proper orientation for resurrection. The exhumation practices themselves followed specific protocols. As mentioned with the Greek Vrykolakas, Saturday was considered the safe day for opening vampire graves. The one day the creature rested deeply enough to allow intervention. The procedure required courage. People believed they were facing a genuine supernatural threat. The body would be examined for signs of vampirism, the preserved appearance, the blood, the hair and nail growth. If the signs were present, destruction followed immediately. Fire represented the ultimate solution. Cremation destroyed the body completely, reducing it to ash that could never rise again. However, fire was expensive and difficult to manage. Burning a corpse required substantial fuel and time. Most communities only resorted to cremation in the worst cases, when other methods had failed or when the vampire had become particularly powerful. The ashes might be scattered, thrown into running water, dispersed so completely that no remnant could serve as an anchor for the undead spirit. These practices continued far longer than we might expect. The Mercy Brown case in Rhode Island happened in 1892. European vampire burials occurred well into the 19th century. Even as science advanced, as education spread, as the modern world emerged, people in some communities continued to treat vampire threats as real and immediate. The archaeological record preserves their actions, the violence they were willing to inflict on the dead out of terror for the living. The vampire began in folklore as a bloated corpse, a plague bearer, a creature of disease and decomposition. Through literature, it transformed into something else entirely: an aristocratic seducer, an immortal philosopher, a figure of dark romance. Understanding this transformation reveals how storytelling reshapes tradition, how writers take raw folklore and craft it into something that serves different cultural needs. The first significant literary vampire appeared in 1819, before the word vampire was widely known in English. John Polidori, personal physician to Lord Byron, published The Vampire, a short story that established many tropes that persist today. Polidori's vampire, Lord Ruthven, was aristocratic, sophisticated, sexually magnetic. He moved through high society, seducing and destroying, using his charm and status as weapons. This vampire bore little resemblance to the bloated Slavic undead. Polidori created something new, blending folklore with Romantic-era sensibilities. The story emerged from the same Geneva gathering in 1816 that produced Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Byron, Shelley, Polidori, and others challenged each other to write ghost stories during a dark, stormy summer. Polidori's contribution, initially attributed to Byron himself, captured public imagination in ways that changed vampire literature permanently. The vampire became less about explaining disease and death, more about exploring forbidden desire and transgressive sexuality. Throughout the 19th century, vampire fiction grew more elaborate. James Malcolm Rymer's Varney the Vampire, serialized in the 1840s, ran to hundreds of pages of melodrama. Varney introduced the idea of the vampire as a tragic figure, cursed rather than simply evil, suffering from his condition rather than reveling in it. This sympathetic interpretation opened new possibilities for the vampire as a character, making it something readers could identify with rather than simply fear. Carmilla, published by Sheridan Le Fanu in 1872, brought explicit female vampirism and lesbian themes into the tradition. Carmilla seduces her female victims, creating relationships that are simultaneously predatory and genuinely affectionate. The novella explores desire, intimacy, the blurred lines between love and consumption. It influenced countless later works, establishing that vampires could embody not just death, but complicated, problematic desire. Then came Dracula. Bram Stoker's 1897 novel synthesized everything that came before while adding crucial innovations. Dracula was aristocratic like Ruthven, tragic in his isolation, seductive and terrifying by turns. But Stoker grounded his vampire in more substantial research than previous writers. He drew on accounts of Vlad the Impaler, incorporated elements of Slavic folklore, created a vampire with specific rules and weaknesses that felt mythological rather than arbitrary. Stoker never traveled to Transylvania. He researched in the British Library, reading travel accounts and folklore collections, building his vampire from written sources. The result combined authentic folkloric elements with Gothic literary traditions. Dracula could transform into a bat or wolf, calling back to shape-shifting traditions. He cast no reflection, expanding on earlier literary motifs. He couldn't enter a home uninvited, drawing on threshold traditions from multiple cultures. He was vulnerable to stakes, holy items, running water, sunlight. The sunlight vulnerability deserves particular attention. In traditional folklore, vampires operated at night primarily because supernatural threats were nocturnal. They weren't necessarily destroyed by sunlight. Stoker made sunlight merely weaken his vampire rather than destroy him outright. Later film interpretations, starting with the 1922 unauthorized adaptation Nosferatu, established that sunlight would incinerate vampires instantly. This became one of the most recognized vampire characteristics, despite having thin roots in original folklore. Dracula succeeded partly through its structure. Stoker told the story through diary entries, letters, newspaper clippings, creating a sense of documentary realism. The vampire wasn't just a gothic fancy. It was presented as something that might be real, supported by evidence recorded by multiple witnesses. This technique made the supernatural feel more plausible, more frightening. The novel also engaged with contemporary anxieties about immigration, sexual propriety, the role of women, the clash between traditional belief and scientific modernity. Dracula came from the East to corrupt the West. He turned proper English women into sexual beings who actively pursued desire. He represented old world superstition, challenging new world rationality. The vampire became a vehicle for exploring what Victorian culture found threatening. 20th century vampire fiction diversified dramatically. Some works emphasized horror and monstrosity. Others leaned into romance and seduction. Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, published in 1976, created vampires who were fully realized characters with complex emotional lives, philosophical depth, genuine relationships with each other. Rice's vampires weren't simply predators or seducers. They were immortals dealing with existence across centuries, suffering from isolation, searching for meaning. Later works pushed the vampire into new territory. Some became action heroes. Others became teenagers navigating high school. The vampire proved flexible enough to serve almost any narrative purpose, from horror to comedy to romance to social commentary. Each iteration moved further from folkloric roots, while carrying traces of those origins. What's remarkable is how completely the literary vampire replaced the folkloric one in popular imagination. Ask someone to describe a vampire, and they'll almost certainly reference Dracula or his descendants. The pale aristocrat, the cape, the seduction, the aversion to sunlight and garlic. They won't describe the bloated Slavic corpse, the hopping Chinese Jiangshi, the decapitated Greek Vrykolakas. Literature transformed the vampire so thoroughly that we've largely forgotten what it was before writers reshaped it. This transformation serves a function. The folkloric vampire explained disease and death in cultures without scientific understanding. As medicine advanced, those explanations became unnecessary. But the vampire as literary figure could explore other aspects of human experience: sexuality, power, immortality, the predatory aspects of desire. The vampire evolved to remain culturally relevant, adapting to serve the needs of each new generation of writers and readers. The vampire exists today beyond folklore and fiction. A small number of people identify as vampires, claiming they need to consume blood or absorb energy from others to maintain their health. Clinical psychology recognizes conditions where people believe they are vampires or need blood. Understanding these modern manifestations reveals how ancient fears persist in new forms. Renfield's syndrome, named after Dracula's blood-drinking servant, describes a psychiatric condition where someone develops a compulsion to consume blood. The condition typically begins in childhood, with some blood-related event, a nosebleed, an injury, tasting their own blood. The person experiences arousal or satisfaction from the experience and begins seeking more opportunities to consume blood. As the condition develops, they may progress from drinking their own blood to seeking animal blood to, in rare cases, attacking others. The syndrome isn't officially recognized in diagnostic manuals, but psychiatrists and psychologists have documented cases. The compulsion appears to be a paraphilia, a sexual fixation, though some patients describe it less in sexual terms and more as a physical need. They report feeling weak or ill without blood, experiencing relief and strength after consuming it. Whether the physical symptoms are psychosomatic or represent something else remains unclear. Clinical vampirism differs from people who identify as part of vampire subcultures. Many modern self-identified vampires don't claim supernatural powers or immortality. They describe themselves as having a condition, something biological or energetic, that requires them to supplement their normal diet with small amounts of blood, or to absorb psychic energy from others. They often practice what they call safe feeding, obtaining blood from willing donors, following health protocols to minimize risk of disease transmission. The vampire community distinguishes between sanguinarian vampires, who consume blood, and psychic or energy vampires, who claim to absorb life force from others through proximity or intention. Sanguinarians typically drink very small amounts of blood from donors who consent to the practice. They may sterilize the feeding site, use lancets to create small punctures, treat the practice with medical seriousness. Most don't believe they're literally undead. They describe having unusual energy needs that blood or energy absorption fulfills. Research into these communities suggests participants come from diverse backgrounds and have varying levels of belief in supernatural aspects. Some view their vampirism as purely biological, a metabolic condition not yet recognized by medicine. Others incorporate spiritual or magical frameworks, seeing themselves as energy workers who process life force differently from average people. Still others engage more as lifestyle choice or subcultural identity, rather than claiming literal need. The question of whether any physiological basis exists for these experiences remains open. No recognized medical condition requires blood consumption from others. Humans can synthesize or obtain from normal food everything available in blood. Some researchers have suggested that people who identify as vampires might have conditions affecting energy levels, iron absorption, or other metabolic processes, leading them to interpret their symptoms through a vampire framework rather than a medical one. Psychologists have noted that vampire identity can serve psychological functions beyond any physical claims. It provides community, a sense of uniqueness, an explanation for feeling different or alienated. In cultures where traditional religious frameworks have weakened, alternative belief systems fill the gap. Vampire identity offers mythology, ritual, community structure, all elements that humans often seek in meaning-making systems. The danger comes when vampire identification leads to harmful behavior. Cases where people have attacked others, claiming to need blood or to be vampires, receive media attention disproportionate to their rarity. Most people who identify as vampires don't harm anyone. They maintain jobs, relationships, normal lives. Their vampirism exists as a private practice or within consenting communities. But the violent cases reinforce stereotypes, conflate consensual subcultures with psychiatric disorders, and perpetuate fear. Treatment for clinical vampirism, when people seek it, typically involves addressing underlying psychiatric conditions. Many cases involve other diagnosed disorders: obsessive-compulsive disorder, psychosis, schizophrenia, paraphilias. Treating those conditions can resolve or reduce the blood-drinking compulsion. Cognitive behavioral therapy can address the beliefs and behaviors. Medication may help with underlying neurological or psychiatric issues. What's fascinating is how modern clinical vampirism connects back to ancient folklore. The belief that consuming blood provides strength and vitality echoes across centuries. The idea that some people need life force from others, that proximity to certain individuals drains you. These concepts appear in cultures worldwide. Modern vampire-identified individuals may not believe they're literally undead corpses rising from graves. but they've adopted symbolism and practices with deep folkloric roots. The vampire endures because it speaks to something persistent in human psychology. We fear death and crave immortality. We're fascinated by predation, by the idea of consuming others to sustain ourselves. We recognize that relationships can drain us, that some people seem to take more than they give. The vampire gives form to these experiences, provides a framework for understanding them. Whether folkloric corpse, literary aristocrat, or modern identity, the vampire persists because the anxieties it represents persist. We've traced the vampire from exhumed graves in medieval villages to modern subcultures, from folk beliefs about disease-spreading corpses to literary masterworks to psychological conditions. The question remains, why does this particular monster persist across centuries, cultures, media? What makes the vampire so enduringly powerful in human imagination? The vampire speaks to fundamental human fears that no amount of scientific advancement fully resolves. Death remains the great unknown. Despite all our medical progress, despite our understanding of biology and physics, we still don't know what happens to consciousness when the body stops. The vampire offers one answer. The dead don't truly leave. They remain changed but present, capable of interacting with the living world. This simultaneously terrifies and comforts. Terror because the dead might harm us. Comfort because death might not be final, because some essence could persist. Disease and contagion create another layer of vampire's power. We understand transmission now, viruses and bacteria, but that knowledge doesn't eliminate fear. Epidemics still happen. Diseases still spread through contact, through proximity. The vampire embodies this transmission fear in visceral form. One vampire creates another through attack. The condition spreads exponentially until communities face annihilation. Every epidemic, from medieval plague to modern pandemics, reactivates these fears. The vampire gives them shape. The predatory aspect resonates because human relationships do involve power exchanges. Some relationships genuinely drain us. We talk about people sucking our energy, taking without giving. We recognize parasitic dynamics in families, workplaces, friendships. The vampire literalizes these metaphors. It feeds on others to sustain itself. It takes what it needs without regard for the cost to victims. This makes it both monster and mirror. We see in the vampire our own worst impulses, our capacity to use others. Sexual dimensions contribute significantly to the vampire's endurance. The creature crosses boundaries in ways both thrilling and threatening. The bite represents penetration, exchange of fluids, intimate contact that transforms the victim. Victorian literature barely concealed the sexual subtext. Modern interpretations make it explicit. The vampire allows exploration of desire outside conventional bounds. Forbidden attraction, dangerous passion, the erotics of surrender and domination. In cultures that police sexuality, the vampire provides a space to examine what's otherwise forbidden. Immortality adds another dimension. Vampires live forever, watching centuries pass, accumulating knowledge and power. They escape the limit that defines human existence. This attracts us even as it disturbs us. What would it mean to live forever? What would you lose? What would you gain? The vampire explores these questions, usually suggesting that immortality brings as much curse as blessing. The vampire gains eternity but loses humanity, gains power but loses sunlight and normal pleasures. It's immortal but dead, powerful but parasitic. The trade-offs make us examine what we actually value about being alive. The vampire's glamour, its aristocratic associations in literature, taps into class anxieties. Vampires are often wealthy, cultured, moving in high society. They prey on ordinary people from positions of privilege. This resonates with experiences of exploitation by elites, the sense that those with power feed on those without. The vampire becomes a critique of wealth inequality, of systems where some people accumulate resources by draining others. It's no accident that vampire fiction often explores wealth, property, inheritance, the mechanisms of power. Cultural outsider status strengthens the vampire's symbolic power. Dracula came from Transylvania to England, an eastern threat to Western civilization. He represented foreign corruption, outside beliefs contaminating the homeland. This xenophobic dimension has unfortunately proven durable, recurring whenever cultures fear outside influence. But it can also be flipped. Vampires as outsiders can represent any marginalized group, anyone excluded from mainstream society. The monster becomes a figure of identification for people who feel different, alien, dangerous in the eyes of the majority. The flexibility of vampire mythology allows it to adapt to each era's specific anxieties. In folklore, vampires explain disease and death. In Victorian literature, they embodied sexual transgression and foreign threat. In 20th century horror, they explored post-war trauma and nuclear fears. In contemporary fiction, they navigate everything from teenage alienation to climate catastrophe. The core imagery stays recognizable, while the meaning shifts to address current concerns. The vampire also benefits from remarkable aesthetic power. The visual elements are striking. Fangs, blood, the pale skin, the dramatic cape in literary versions. These images reproduce well across media. Vampires translate effectively to stage, screen, comics, every form of visual storytelling. The bite leaves a mark, creating iconic imagery that's immediately recognizable. The transformation from human to monster provides dramatic opportunity. Visually, practically, the vampire simply works as a storytelling device. Community plays a role in the vampire's persistence. People gather around vampire media, form fan communities, create subcultures. The vampire provides a framework for group identity. Whether it's people who cosplay as vampires, who identify as vampires in their personal lives, who simply love vampire fiction, these communities keep the mythology alive and evolving. They generate new interpretations, new stories, new ways of understanding what the vampire means. Perhaps most fundamentally, the vampire endures because it asks questions we can't fully answer. What defines humanity? Where are the boundaries between life and death? What happens to the soul? How do we relate to the past? What are we willing to sacrifice for survival or power? The vampire keeps these questions active, keeps us thinking about them, because the vampire embodies them in concrete, dramatic form. We need monsters. We need ways to externalize fear, to examine darkness, to explore what we find threatening or forbidden. The vampire serves this function better than almost any other creature in our mythology. It's human enough to identify with, monstrous enough to fear, flexible enough to mean many things. It walks the boundary between living and dead, predator and person, desire and destruction. That liminal position gives it power that crosses cultures and centuries. The vampire won't disappear, as long as we fear death, disease, predation, as long as we're fascinated by immortality, power, forbidden desire. The vampire will persist. It will keep changing, adapting, taking new forms. But it will remain recognizable, carrying forward elements of those first folk beliefs about corpses that wouldn't stay in the ground. From grave to page to screen, to our collective imagination, the vampire endures. The vampire's journey from folklore to modern icon reveals something essential about how humans process fear and build meaning. What began as desperate attempts to explain disease and death became rich mythology that speaks to anxieties that transcend any single culture or era. Those medieval villagers who opened graves searching for vampires weren't fools. They were using the best frameworks they had to understand terrible losses. When families died of tuberculosis one after another, when plague swept through villages, when bodies showed strange signs that no one could explain, the vampire made sense. It provided explanation, and it suggested action. You could fight it. You could protect yourself and those you loved. Modern science gives us better explanations for what those people saw, but we haven't eliminated the fears that drove them. We still fear death, contagion, the darkness beyond what we can control. We still search for ways to make sense of loss, to fight back against what threatens us. The vampire evolves with us, taking forms that speak to each generation's specific terrors while carrying forward the weight of centuries of belief. Sleep well, knowing that some mysteries persist across time, that some monsters never truly die. They simply transform, waiting in the darkness of our collective imagination, ready to emerge when we need them to make sense of what frightens us. Thanks for being here. Sleep well, and see you next time.